Hello, gunfighters, and welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about gunfighting and gun-related stuff the right way with God at the center. Gonna try something a little bit different. You guys are probably familiar if you've listened for any length of time. The Better Know a Cartridge episodes. They're kind of short episodes on a pretty particular topic, so I think I'm gonna forego the lengthy bio. Try to abbreviate it. First and foremost, I am a Christian. That is number one in my life, serving God, following Jesus. Combat veteran, served in the United States Marine Corps and the Army. Also law enforcement veteran, private contractor, state rifle and pistol champion. Pretty succinct. You want to support? Go to Patreon. Should be a link in the show notes. Boom. Let's get into the day's cartridge. The 375 Whelen and the 400 Whelen. That's right, a double today. Because they're pretty closely related, we're going to talk about those and how they relate to the, let's say, fairly well renowned in its own right, 35 Whelen. And I didn't know this until doing some recent research. I believe that the 400 Whelen was the first of these. Now, if you're familiar with the 35 Whelen, these share a common theme in that Whelen had something to do with developing them. That would be Townsend Whelen. You might want to look him up and read a biography on him if you want. His name is on them. Likewise, they're all based on the 30-06 case. A very versatile case. Let's say the father or grandfather of many, many Wildcats. The 35 Whelen, the 25-06, the 270, the 280, the 6.5-06, and there's a ton more. But today, let's start with the 400 Whelen. Talk about that one and we'll work our way down. Thanks to a patron, I have a Cartridges of the World book here. And let's look at the 400 Whelen. Was not a successful development because the expansion of the 30-06 case necked to its size leaves only a very slight shoulder. This can give rise to serious headspace problems, particularly with incautious hand loading and sloppy chamber practices. Nonetheless, proper built custom rifles in this chambering were used successfully in the United States, Canada, and Africa on big game. And without getting too nerdy, there's a couple of different ways to headspace. Probably the original was the headspace on a rim. Something like a 30-30 has a rim, a 45-70 has a rim, 45 Long Colt has a rim. There's an easy way, especially when manufacturing tolerances aren't as good as they are today in metallurgy, to headspace. But for obvious reasons, they don't stack well on, let's say they don't stack well vertically in a magazine because that rim can get caught up, cause what's called rim lock. Cartridges, the 30-06, they don't have a protruding rim, so you can't headspace on those. Well, by that time, shoulders were fairly common, so you could just headspace on the shoulder. And what they're saying here is if you make that so big, make it that 400 size, that 40, there's not much of a shoulder to headspace on. So they're saying it can be an issue, but they're also saying that people have used it successfully. So this is probably not the round to learn to hand load on. But if you know what you're doing, you know how to hand load, and you're fairly decent at it, it wouldn't be a concern to me. Be cautious with it, but they're saying that's a potential issue for this. They only have one bullet weight listed here. That's the 300 grain. We've got velocities from 2100 to 2265 with a 300 grain bullet for the 400 Whelen. Now let's look at what Wikipedia has to say. Townsend Whelen, while he was commanding officer of the Frankfurt Arsenal in the early 1920s, and it says this cartridge resembles a 30-06 Springfield case next up the 40 caliber to accept bullets manufactured for the 405 Winchester, which is a very cool cartridge in its own right. And very similar, it lists 300 grain bullet at 2300, but it lists a 350 grain bullet on here at 2100. Per Wikipedia, so take this for what it's worth, it says effective for killing elk, moose, and bear. It ranges up to 400 yards. I would say, yeah, I'm sure that it would. Now let's look at the 375 Whelen, or the 375 Ackley Improved. It says this one was not developed by Colonel Townsend Whelen, but was named in his honor. The The cartridge was actually the work of the late gunsmith and writer L.R. Bob Wallach in 1951, based on the 30-06 case necked up. There are two versions, one based on the standard case and retaining the original 17-degree 30-minute shoulder angle, and the other, the improved case with a 40-degree shoulder angle. And one of the big reasons you would do that is to give you more powder capacity. I'm looking again at the Cartridges of the World book, and you say 375, you almost automatically, if you know all about cartridges, you think 375 H&H, 375 Holland and Holland. And here's what it says, general comments. The 375 Whelen is not as powerful as the 375 H&H Magnum, but is nevertheless a good medium bore for applications against most dangerous game. It is certainly adequate for any North American big game. It uses bullets from 200 to 300 grains. And to look at some numbers here, you're looking at 200 grain at 2400, it's pretty respectable, and a 300 grain at 2110. Those are some pretty respectable numbers. Now, if you're choosing between these two, I really don't see why you would go with the 400 Whelen, honestly. Even if you mitigated by really judicious hand loading all of the issues with the headspace, 375 is by far a more common bullet. And I think while either one of these is pretty much going to be a hand loading proposition, you're going to have a lot more options with the 375 Whelen. And you might say, why not just go with a 375 H&H? Well, maybe you're big into the 30-06 and the derivatives of the 30-06. 30-06 brass is way more common. Plus, if the 375 Whelen will cut anything on the North American continent, and that's the only place you ever plan to go, maybe you don't want to have to get and deal with the Magnum belted 375 H&H case. It's a valid argument. Which begs the question, how does it stack up with a cartridge I really like, the 35 Whelen? If you don't know, did a whole episode on the 35 Whelen, which did quite well. You can look that one up. I'm not going to get into redo a complete episode on the 35 Whelen, but you have to mention it when comparing these cartridges. The 35 Whelen, unlike these two, made it to the big leagues. It's not a Wildcat. It is an actual cartridge. So if you're interested in these cartridges and you want a factory option, the 35 Whelen is it. Back to the cartridges of the world. The 35 Whelen, which basically is a 30-06 necked up to 35 caliber. I got the low end in here at 180 grain. Honestly, if you're low 180 grains, why not just go with the 30-06? But it lists the 180 grain at 2700, so it'd be a fine bullet. And it goes up to 250 grains. 250 at 2400. That's respectable. If you don't know, at least in my opinion, although more velocity will give you higher numbers as far as energy, energy does not equal stopping power. I know that people think that it does, but, go shoot an elk in the foot and see if you recover it. Same amount of energy. It's the provision of God first and foremost, and tissue damage that lets me go from meat on the hoof to meat on the table. And that's a good load. That's often that medium velocity, a big, heavy bullet at moderate velocities. Throughout all different calibers, the 9.3 by 62, the 35 Remington, 180 to 200 grain 30-06, 160 grain, 6.5 by 55 Swede. These have a reputation and have for a long time for being really good, efficient, effective rounds. And I think for that reason, those bullet weights have a big, heavy bullet, at least for caliber, at a moderate velocity. Not a slow velocity, but a moderate velocity. And that's a good way to put down game. Again, you're looking at a 250 grain bullet at 2,400 feet a second. So, why would you choose one over the other? Unless you just want something novel and you want to shoot 405 caliber bullets, I'd say rule out the 400 Whelen. If you want a factory option, we already talked about that, it's the 35 Whelen. You want to be able to buy ammo in a box. If you're hand loading, I think either one of these. I think the big question is, do you want the most versatile? In that case, I'd say it's the 35 Whelen. Do you want to be able to shoot bigger, heavier bullets? I'd say in that case, you'd have to give it to the 375 Whelen. If you're going that, you might as well do the Ackley Improved version. You're hand loading it anyway, right? Because again, that 375 in this book goes up to 300 grains. Look at 250 versus 300. That's 1/6 more bullet weight. Maybe you like the 300 grain bullets. Maybe you like the 375. You already have other things chambered in 375. I think both are good options. I think the 35 Whelen is probably the easier of the two, even for hand loading. But the 375 would not be a bad choice. Again, that 35 Whelen, and there's a lot of different numbers. You could probably push it hotter if you're hand loading. You could likely even get some factory loads that are hotter than the numbers in here. But you're talking about, again, that 250 and the 35 Whelen at 2400. And then you're talking the 375 Whelen. You got a 270 listed here at 2380, which is pretty much just barely under, right? That's 20 feet per second is a lot of times within the margin of error. And you're talking a 270 grain bullet, or you're talking a 300 grain bullet at 2100. Now going from the 375, which is a 300 listed at 2100, you can move up to the 400 Whelen, which is a 300 at 2265, or all the way up to a 350 at 2100. Any of these cartridges are going to be good for big North American game. I mean, they'll all kill a whitetail, but I mean, a 243 is great on whitetail. So I think if you're running these, you're looking at big game. Elk, big black bear, brown bear, things like that. And they'll all do really well. You're talking about spot and stalk hunting, which I dearly like, and still hunting. Hitting in reasonable ranges, I would consider inside 300 yards. Really, any of these will kill anything you want to. Caveat that you put the bullet in a decent place and you choose a bullet of proper construction. You could get any of these and load them with a full metal jacket, assuming they make full metal jackets in 405 caliber, I have no idea. If they make a full metal jacket, super hot load of 400 Whelen, you'd have been better off with a good Remington core lock in 30-06 because it's a better bullet design. Bullet construction is really important. So one of the reasons I would look at the 35 Whelen or the 375 Whelen, they have a lot more bullet options and bullet construction options. It's not just about weight and diameter and speed and ballistics coefficient. Really important is the bullet construction, so don't overlook that. With proper bullet construction and decent shot placement, moose, black bear, elk, these are good rounds. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed today's cartridge talk. A lot of people, there's a certain subsection that really likes these obscure cartridges. Enough so that I keep doing them. If you would like to contact me for whatever reason, hopefully a good one, maybe suggest a cartridge for a cartridge talk I have not done yet, goodshepherdtraining.com. Again, goodshepherdtraining.com. If you're watching this on YouTube, these cartridge talks tend to do fairly well on there. Please consider checking out podcasts if you don't already listen to podcasts. Primarily, these are done as podcasts on Spotify and iTunes, iHeartRadio. They're free, so you might want to go check them out there. Anyway, with that, the tactical verse of the day, because that's more important than gun stuff. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. He certainly saved mine. If you don't have a personal relationship, if Jesus Christ is not your Savior, that is far more important. You could win every single gunfight and die and go to hell, and what was it all for? You could kill the biggest, baddest beasts on the planet. And I like killing beasts and eating them, and I don't apologize for it. But what does all that matter if you gain the whole world and lose your own soul? That's more important. Let's not lose sight of what's really important. Let's not let the shiny trinkets of Babylon distract us from the important things in life. The first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment. And the second like it is this, You shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Thanks, men, and have a blessed day.